They told me he drowned. They said it quickly, almost gently, as if softening the tone could soften the world collapsing inside my chest. And when I said I didn't believe a single word of it, they exchanged glances the way people do when they've already decided a woman of my age is grieving past the point of reason. I remember standing there on the riverbank, the mud clinging to my shoes, the air thick with the metallic smell of late summer water, and hearing one of the officers say, "It happens fast with children this young." But nothing about that day was fast. Everything unfolded in a slow, deliberate spiral that made too much sense to be an accident and too little sense to be a tragedy I was expected to accept. They told me to go home and rest, told me I'd be called if anything turned up, and when they left, I remained standing, watching the surface of the river as it moved with the indifferent certainty of nature, knowing deep in my bones that no river had taken my grandson from me. It was people. It was choices. It was someone's lie, layered, rehearsed, and sealed before I even had a chance to scream. I didn't scream, though. I never have. My voice does other things. It cracks. It stiffens. It folds into itself. But it has never risen to a pitch that breaks glass. I was 60 then, still strong, still carrying groceries without help, still keeping my late husband's tools in careful order out in the shed, still believing that the family I raised would always hear me before dismissing me. But that day taught me otherwise. My son avoided my eyes. His wife held her arms crossed tightly, as if bracing against an unseen wind. The two of them kept whispering to each other, arguing about the timeline, going over details as though they were memorizing them rather than recalling them. When I asked where exactly they were standing when Luca wandered off, they both answered, but not to me, offering their words toward the ground, or toward each other, or toward the trees. My questions floated unanswered in the damp air, as if they weighed nothing at all. And I realized in a quiet, devastating moment that nobody there cared to look for the truth. They only wanted to wrap the day in a quick explanation and bury it under condolences. The strange thing is, the memory that haunts me most from that afternoon is not the river, nor the little shoe the officers claimed washed up half a mile away, nor the uneasy way the sky dulled to a pale silver as though nature itself refused to glow. What I remember most vividly is the way Luca's mother adjusted her hair, smoothing it behind her ear with a gesture too elegant, too composed for a woman who'd just lost her child. There was no trembling, no frantic scanning of the water, no collapse into her husband's arms. Only that slow, precise tuck of a strand of blonde hair as she murmured, "He must have slipped." Those words, soft as they were, carried the dead weight of finality as if she'd been preparing them long before the officers arrived. And something in me, some instinct older than language, recoiled. Grandmothers know things. We notice the shift in a child's laughter before the parents do. We know when the doctor is wrong before he finishes the sentence. And we certainly know when a story is being handed to us already wrapped in a bow we never asked for. People say grief distorts memory, but I promise you, sometimes grief is the only thing that keeps memory intact. I remember Luca's hand in mine that morning, sticky from jam, warm with the simple trust only children possess, swinging gently as he skipped beside me down to the water. I remember how he kept showing me every smooth stone he found, how he wanted to keep them all because each one looked like something: a boat, a loaf of bread, a sleeping cat. And I remember how his mother grew irritated, telling him to stop bothering Grandma as if his wonder were noise, as if my joy were inconvenience. I remember thinking, not for the first time, that she never liked how easily he came to me, how naturally he leaned toward the people who actually saw him. Maybe that was the first warning. One of many I ignored because mothers are taught to be patient and grandmothers are taught to be silent. That silence hardened the moment the investigation was abruptly closed. They said I was clinging to fantasies. They told the neighbors I was old and confused, though at 60, I was hardly either. They suggested therapy groups for acceptance, as though acceptance were a virtue rather than surrender. Even my own son started speaking to me the way one speaks to a child who has interrupted adult conversation, gentle, patronizing, full of little sighs. I would sit across from him at their kitchen table, watching him run a hand over his face as he repeated the official story, and I'd think, this is not the boy I raised. My son had once been the kind of child who refused to let a lost dog go unsearched for. Now he asked me to stop asking questions about his own missing child. Pain erodes people in different ways, but deceit shapes them more quickly. It's strange to say, but the house became quieter after that, almost reverent, as if hosting the absence of a child required a certain decorum. Toys disappeared. Her photo frames rearranged themselves on shelves. Only the ones featuring her side of the family remained. My son threw himself into work. She threw herself into anything that kept her from looking at me. I became someone who entered rooms softly so as not to disturb whatever brittle piece they were manufacturing. I'd sit alone on the porch swing, listening to the boards creak beneath me, and think about how quick the world is to silence older women, how easy it is to rewrite our certainty as hysteria. But I was never hysterical. I was simply certain. Certain that lies leave traces, certain that one day the truth would rise the way bodies rise in water that refuses to hold them. Years turned me into a woman people pitied for the wrong reasons. They pitied my delusion, not my loss. They pitied my loneliness, not the possibility that my grandson might still be somewhere breathing air meant for him. I became a cautionary tale in the neighborhood. The grandmother who clung to hope like it was a vice. I aged into a quieter life, a smaller life, a life where my truth lived only in my notebooks and in the unlit corners of my thoughts. But even now, as I sit here in this little house near the river, older, slower, but still unwilling to apologize for the way I hold on, I can feel the same clarity I felt the moment they told me he drowned. A lie has a temperature. Sometimes it's cold, metallic, efficient. Sometimes it's warm, almost compassionate, like a hand on your shoulder urging you to stop asking questions. This one was warm, too warm, and warmth like that comes only from people you trusted. I don't know why I'm telling all of this now. Maybe because age strips away the remaining layers of politeness. Maybe because I've reached a season of life where the truth outweighs the fear of being dismissed. Or maybe because, after 22 years of living with a ghost, I have begun to feel him stir again. Not in memory, not in dreams, but in the world itself. Something has shifted. Something has risen, and I, an old woman with a quiet voice and a stubborn heart, am finally ready to speak the sentence that has lived in my bones since that day. My grandson didn't drown. Someone carried him away. And the person who did it once kissed my cheek and called me family. I remember the exact moment the ground beneath my life shifted, not violently the way people imagine revelation works, but with the slow, grinding certainty of something long overdue, as if a hinge that had rusted shut for years finally gave way under the pressure of truth. It happened 3 days after the so-called drowning, when I went to the police station alone, carrying a folder of notes I had written in my slanted handwriting. Times, distances, observations no one had bothered to collect because everyone was so eager to close the case and box up my grandson's life like a pair of misplaced shoes. I sat on a hard plastic chair across from a detective who pretended to be patient while his knee bounced under the table with barely concealed irritation. And I told him again that Luca had never wandered off on his own, that he had always stayed close, that he was afraid of the river since the spring flood 2 years earlier. The detective didn't bother hiding his doubt. He simply folded his hands and said the sentence that became the first true crack in the official story. Your son already confirmed the boy liked playing near the water. It wasn't the content that jolted me, it was the phrasing. My son hadn't said that. I knew his voice, his patterns, his need to sound responsible. Those words were not his. They were someone else's polished insertion into the narrative, neatly aligned with the version that blamed no one and questioned nothing. I left the police station with the kind of nausea that comes not from sorrow, but from recognition, because lies have fingerprints, and I had just felt the smudge of one. That evening, I drove to my son's house determined to confront him, but when I pulled up to the curb, the lights were dim, and the house looked too clean, too organized for a family shattered by loss. Through the kitchen window, I saw my daughter-in-law wiping the counters in slow circles, not crying, not pacing, not collapsing under the weight of what she claimed had happened. There was something rehearsed in her movements, something oddly serene, and it reminded me of the way she used to smooth tablecloths before guests arrived. Her face the same neutral mask of concentration that hid every real thought she never allowed to surface. I knocked, and she opened the door with a tight-lipped smile that flickered too quickly for grief. She ushered me inside like someone welcoming a polite acquaintance, not the grandmother of the child she had supposedly lost. And she guided me to the living room, where my son sat, staring at a blank television screen, as though waiting for instructions. When he turned to me, his eyes were swollen, but not from crying. More from exhaustion or something heavier, a tension that didn't match the sterile calm of the house. I asked him if he had spoken to the police again, and he nodded too quickly, as if afraid of being questioned further. "Mom, we already told them everything," he said, but his tone held a hollow echo, the sound of someone repeating lines rather than speaking from memory. I pressed gently at first, then firmly, asking him to tell me again the sequence of events. He hesitated, and that hesitation was the match that lit the fuse. He started to describe where he had been standing, how he had turned for just a moment, and then, mid-sentence, he glanced toward the hallway, where his wife stood watching us with her arms crossed, and her expression unreadable. He swallowed, corrected himself, shifted 2 details, then added a third that contradicted what he'd told me on the day it happened. My heart knocked once against my ribs, hard enough to feel like warning. I knew then that the story they were telling was not the story they had lived. Something had been edited, trimmed, curated, and the curator was standing in the hallway with her arms folded like a gatekeeper. I left their house with the taste of metal on my tongue, and as I stepped into the night air, a string of small, unsettling memories began to resurface. Moments I had dismissed, because that is what older women are trained to do. Absorb the strangeness and keep moving. I remembered how my daughter-in-law had insisted on taking Luca to her friend's house the week before, though he didn't want to go. I remembered how she had started locking certain drawers in their home, claiming she was organizing medicine. I remembered how she scolded Luca for always running to Grandma, as if his affection made him disloyal. These details had floated around me like dust motes, visible only when the light hit just right. And now, in the aftermath of the police station, they fell into a pattern too sharp to ignore. But the true catalyst, the moment everything snapped into focus, came the next morning, when I returned to the river alone. The area had been taped off earlier in the week, but now the tape lay curled and limp in the mud, forgotten by everyone except me. The water glittered with the same indifferent current, and I walked along the bank, my feet sinking into the soft earth. I found the spot where the officers claimed Luca had slipped, a sloped patch of mud leading into the shallowest part of the river, no deeper than my knees. I knelt, ignoring the pain in my joints, and examined the ground. There were footprints, yes, but none matched the size of a small child's. Instead, there were two sets, one large, one medium. Adult, perhaps older child or teenager. Not Luca. And the shoe they claimed belonged to him? The one they said washed downstream? I'd seen it the day before in a plastic bag at the station. It was pristine. No river mud, no algae, no silt. As if someone had taken it from his room and dropped it as a prop. My fingers dug into the mud as a cold clarity washed over me. Luca hadn't wandered. Luca hadn't slipped. Luca hadn't drowned. Luca had been taken. And the only people close enough to do it without drawing suspicion were the ones who had spent the last 3 days hurrying to shut me up. Standing up felt like lifting the weight of an entire world. But once I did, I knew I would never again be the quiet grandmother they expected. The river had not stolen my grandson. Someone else had, and the first ripples of that truth had just begun to disturb the surface of every lie they thought I was too old, too weary, too broken to challenge. In that moment, the grief inside me hardened into something sharper, something steel-thin and unbreakable. A woman who has lost everything is dangerous, but a woman who has been lied to while being told to sit quietly with her grief is something far more formidable. And I promised myself, standing in the damp earth with the river murmuring at my feet, that I would follow every thread, no matter who tried to cut it, no matter what it revealed. Because Luca deserved a grandmother who would not rest until truth, not comfort, not politeness, not convenience, was the story that survived. I felt the first true tightening of the noose not in a moment of confrontation or discovery, but in the slow, grinding creep of ordinary days that began folding themselves into shapes I didn't recognize. After that morning at the river, after I saw the footprints that didn't belong to a child and the mud that didn't cling to the shoe they claimed was Luca's, I expected something dramatic to happen. A sudden rupture in the facade, a confession, a slip of the tongue, anything that would validate the storm gathering inside me. But real erasure is never loud. Real cruelty happens in quiet ways, in the steady drip of dismissals and diversions, in the subtle shifting of truth, until you begin to doubt the angle of your own memories. My son and his wife perfected that art in the weeks that followed. They didn't argue with me. They didn't scream or accuse. They simply tightened the borders of their world until I no longer fit inside it. It began with small exclusions, almost polite in their execution. I would call, and my daughter-in-law would answer in a whisper, saying they were resting or not up for visitors. I would arrive at their door with soup or groceries, and they would meet me on the porch, stepping outside just enough to keep me from crossing the threshold. The first few times they blamed exhaustion, grief, the chaos of paperwork and condolences, and I accepted the excuses because grief does distort the rhythms of a home. But the excuses calcified. They became routine. The porch became a barrier as firm as a locked gate, and I began to understand that I was being managed rather than comforted. Their distance was not for healing. It was for containment. They wanted to control what I saw, what I heard, what I might discover if allowed too close. Their neighbors, people I had known for years, began to treat me differently. They approached me with that careful, pitying tone, reserved for those rumored to be unwell, speaking slowly, offering gentle pats on the arm, murmuring that time heals and acceptance brings peace. At first, I couldn't understand where this softness was coming from, but then I overheard a conversation while walking past the bakery, my name spoken with that familiar mixture of concern and condescension. "It's so sad," one woman said. "She can't let go. She really believes the child is still alive." Another chimed in. "His mother told me the grandmother is confused, maybe slipping mentally. They're trying to get her help." I stopped in the shadow of a maple tree, the smell of yeast and sugar drifting through the open door, and felt the world tilt. It wasn't grief they were spreading about me. It was doubt. It wasn't compassion. It was discrediting. My own son had allowed people to think I was losing my mind rather than admit that his wife's story smelled like rot. Inside their house, because eventually I stepped inside again, whether I was wanted there or not. The changes were even more telling. Toys had vanished completely. Every trace of Luca's presence scrubbed from the surfaces as if he were an embarrassment, rather than a boy who should have been playing in the yard. His drawings, once proudly taped to the refrigerator, were gone. His favorite blanket, the one with little blue stars, nowhere in sight. When I asked about them, my daughter-in-law smiled lightly and said she had donated everything for emotional closure. Emotional closure, to her, looked suspiciously like erasure. My son didn't even look up from the paperwork he pretended to read, papers that rustled but never seemed to turn. What disturbed me more than the absence of Luca's belongings was the presence of new rules that applied only to me. They asked me not to bring up the river. They asked me not to mention inconsistencies. They asked me not to ask questions when the two of them contradicted each other about where they had been standing that day. Every visit was a performance, and I was expected to play the part of the grieving grandmother who accepted the script handed to her, even as each line felt like a stone lodged in my throat. When I deviated, when I asked something as simple as, "Who was watching him when you stepped away?" my daughter-in-law would purse her lips and sigh in that brittle way, and my son would rub his temples, saying he couldn't keep having this conversation. I began keeping a notebook, documenting every odd glance, every shift in tone, every lapse in their story. I didn't tell them, of course. I wrote late at night in my kitchen with the curtains drawn, my handwriting growing sharper the more they tried to blunt me. And somewhere in those pages, a pattern formed. Not of proof, but of intention. They weren't trying to remember the details. They were trying to make me forget them. They weren't grieving. They were rearranging. And then came the moment that sealed my understanding. Quiet, but unmistakable. I had gone to their house to drop off a casserole, something to convince them I was still harmless enough to approach. My daughter-in-law met me at the door, her smile tight, her eyes flicking behind me as though checking if someone had followed. She invited me in, but only after glancing toward the living room where my son sat, slumped on the couch, his jaw clenched. I stepped into the foyer and noticed, for the first time, a new lock on the basement door. Heavy, metal, recently installed. It hadn't been there the last time I visited. The door itself was unremarkable, painted the same cream as the walls, but the lock shone like something too new, too deliberate. I paused, staring at it longer than I meant to, and in that pause, my daughter-in-law's voice sharpened. "We just had to secure a few things. Childproofing," she said, though there were no children left in the house to protect. I nodded slowly, but the explanation hung in the air with the weight of absurdity. Later that same evening, my son walked me to my car, something he hadn't done in years, and he placed a hand on my shoulder, not affectionate, not even comforting, but firm, as if pinning me in place. "Mom," he said, "we need you to stop coming by unannounced. It's too hard for us." I searched his face for any sign of the boy he once was, the boy who used to run into my arms without hesitation, but all I saw was a man exhausted by the effort of maintaining someone else's lie. "And please," he added, dropping his hand, "let the past go. Let the past go." As if the past had drowned in that river too. As if letting go were a kindness rather than a burial. From that night, the distance wasn't subtle anymore. They answered fewer calls. They blocked me from the daycare app that once sent photos of Luca's days. They changed their routines, their tone, even the configuration of their lives, as if trimming every branch I might cling to. And the more they withdrew, the more obvious it became that their fear was not of grief, but of exposure. Something they had built together, something fragile, something damaging, required my silence to stand. But silence has never been my natural state, no matter how the world prefers older women to fold themselves into quiet corners. Their avoidance, their tightening boundaries, their nervous glances, the new lock, the erased belongings. Each piece deepened the darkness around the truth instead of hiding it. And I felt the first true escalation unfolding not as a revelation, but as a realization that I was no longer simply grieving. I was being methodically shut out, pushed away, redirected like an inconvenience. I understood then that whatever had happened to Luca was not an accident, and whatever story they were guarding was not a misunderstanding. It was intentional. It was constructed, and I had just begun to see the edges of the construction, sharp enough to cut, but unfinished enough to expose its builders. The first real shift inside me did not arrive with thunder or confrontation. It arrived in the quiet hours of a morning when I sat alone in my kitchen, the smell of burnt toast lingering in the air, and realized that I could not keep living inside. The script they had written for me, something in me, something old and stubborn and long underestimated, began to move. It wasn't hope, not yet, but a kind of internal straightening, a settling of my spine that felt like memory returning to a body that had been hunched too long. I looked out the window, watching the river twist behind the tree line, as it always had, and instead of seeing the place where they told me Luca died, I saw the place where lies had been born. That morning, I decided that if no one else would search for answers, then I would have to find them myself, no matter how long it took or how small my steps were. I put on my coat, the one still smelling faintly of cedar, and left the house without calling anyone, feeling a strange clarity I hadn't felt since before everything went dark. My first step was simple, but felt monumental. I drove to the community library, not because I thought they hid answers there, but because I needed a place where no one knew me as the grieving grandmother who couldn't let go. a place where I could breathe without someone watching my face for cracks. The librarian, a woman with soft gray hair and a sweater that smelled of lavender, greeted me kindly without recognition, and the absence of pity felt like a blessing. I sat at a long wooden table and began researching cases of child disappearances, drownings without bodies, misidentified remains. At first, my hands trembled on the keyboard, but after a while, the tremble faded, replaced by a slow, steady rhythm. I found patterns, things the police never mentioned, little inconsistencies in how quickly they closed similar cases, names of officers who had been reprimanded for mishandled investigations. I took notes, pages and pages of them, not knowing yet what I was chasing, but knowing it mattered. Each fact I uncovered felt like a stitch pulled loose from the fabric of the story I had been fed. Around noon, I left the library and walked to a small cafe nearby, the kind that had cracked mugs and a chalkboard menu that changed daily. I sat at a corner table, sipping bitter coffee and watching families drift in and out. At another table sat a woman around my age, wearing a deep green scarf and reading a mystery novel with the sort of focused contentment I hadn't felt in years. When she looked up and caught my eye, she smiled, warmly, without hesitation. And something about that simple gesture, that uncomplicated kindness from a stranger, made the air in my chest loosen a little. As I left the cafe, I realized that the world outside my son's tight little circle of control felt startlingly open. Terrifying, yes, but open. I could move in it. I could act in it. I was not trapped in the narrative they wanted me to repeat like a mantra. The next day, I returned to the river, not to mourn, but to examine with a clearer mind. I brought a walking stick and an old pair of gardening gloves. I climbed down the embankment, feeling the scent of damp soil wrap around me like a familiar shawl. The footprints I had seen before were blurred now by rain, but new disturbances marked the mud, fresh indentations where someone had stood recently. It unsettled me, but it also sharpened my curiosity. Why come back here unless something remained unfinished? I crouched low, tracing the shapes with my gloved hand, and my breath hitched when I noticed faint traces of tire marks near the tree line. Nothing dramatic, nothing conclusive, but enough to suggest that someone had driven close to the spot after the incident. It felt like a whisper, a ghost of truth brushing past me, urging me to keep going. When I rose, my legs stiff and my gloves filthy, I noticed a man on the opposite bank watching me. He wore a brown jacket and leaned on a railing, pretending to look at the water, but every few seconds, his gaze flicked my way. For a moment, I wondered if I was imagining it, but no. The stillness around him felt intentional. He wasn't just passing through. When he eventually turned and walked toward the parking lot, I memorized the unusual curve of his shoulders, the way he moved with a cautious, deliberate stride. I didn't know who he was or whether he was connected to anything, but I felt the prickle of awareness creep through me. Someone else had a stake in this riverbank. Someone else had been watching. The shift in me grew stronger over the next days. I stopped calling my son. I stopped answering when my daughter-in-law sent stiff, sanitized messages about giving space. Instead, I focused on what was real. I organized my notes. I called old acquaintances who remembered Luca's birthmark, Luca's laugh, Luca's fear of deep water. People who once held him. People who hadn't rewritten their memories to fit a tidy tragedy. Their recollections aligned with mine, not with the official version recited to me like a lullaby meant to rock me into submission. Every conversation strengthened the quiet, building certainty inside me that I had not been mistaken, not delusional, not fragile. I was remembering correctly. I was seeing clearly. One afternoon, while flipping through an old photo album, a small envelope fell out. Inside was a picture I hadn't looked at in years, Luca sitting on my lap, his little hand gripping a yellow toy truck, his smile open and bright. Behind us stood my son and his wife, their expressions oddly strained, even in that joyful moment. Something about the image struck me as wrong, or perhaps it struck me as too revealing. I stared at their faces, noticing details I hadn't seen before. The tension around her eyes, the stiffness of his arm around her waist, the way they both seemed to be leaning slightly away from us rather than toward. That photograph became an anchor, a reminder of the truth I had lived, not the lie they wanted me to swallow. And then something unexpected happened. Not dramatic, but deeply altering. I received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with only 4 words. You were right. Keep going. The handwriting was careful, unfamiliar, almost timid. The message was vague, but it struck me with the force of a confession. Someone out there, someone who knew something, wanted me to continue searching. The letter didn't prove anything, but it validated everything. When I held that paper between my fingers, the world around me felt momentarily still, as if the universe itself had paused to acknowledge that the path I was on, uncertain as it was, led toward truth rather than madness. From that moment, the shift inside me solidified. I was no longer a grandmother drowning in grief while the world patted her hand and urged her to sleep. I was a woman reclaiming her agency after years of being dismissed, minimized, made small. I felt taller, though my body had not changed. I felt younger, though time had not reversed. I felt awake in a way that made the colors of the world seem sharper, the sounds more precise, the lies more brittle. For the first time since Luca vanished, I didn't feel like I was reaching into darkness. I felt like the darkness was retreating, inch by inch, from a light I hadn't realized I still carried. That was the midpoint I didn't know I needed. Not a discovery of facts, but a discovery of myself. A shift from being acted upon to acting. A rejection of their version of events. A quiet but irrevocable step toward reclaiming a truth they had buried beneath layers of false comfort and structured silence. And as I stood in my kitchen once more, the letter open beside my teacup, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever lay ahead, whatever pain, whatever revelation, I would no longer meet it as the woman they tried to break. I would meet it as the woman I had always been beneath the years of politeness and imposed frailty, persistent, clear-eyed, and utterly unwilling to let the last real piece of my heart vanish without a fight. By the time the days began folding into one another with that strange mixture of heaviness and sharpness that comes only when truth is circling you without yet landing, I could feel the world around me tightening again, as if every step forward took summoned a pressure determined to push me back into silence. It began subtly, the way storms begin with a shift in the air rather than a bolt of lightning. My son's wife started appearing in places she had never bothered to go before. Outside the grocery store, near the post office, even passing by my street as if by coincidence. Each time she waved with that polished, brittle smile of hers, the one that held more calculation than warmth. And each time I felt a prickling along the back of my neck, a sense that she was measuring my movements the way people measure the behavior of a dog they fear might turn feral. I didn't acknowledge her beyond a nod, but her presence began to feel like an omen, a silent drumbeat warning me that I was approaching something they'd rather keep buried. The pressure mounted further when strange interruptions threaded themselves into my routines. One afternoon, I returned from the library to find my front gate unlatched, though I had closed it that morning. Another time, the screen door stood ajar, its frame clicking softly in the breeze. Nothing inside the house was disturbed, no objects misplaced, no drawers opened. But that only heightened my unease. Someone had entered not to steal, but to look, not to vandalize, but to evaluate. The thought left a metallic taste on my tongue, and for the first time since the search for answers had begun, I double-checked every lock at night. Even then, I could not shake the feeling that someone was watching from beyond the hedges, someone who knew far too much about the river, the lies, the inconsistencies, and the slow awakening building inside me. Days later, something more direct happened. A man knocked on my door just past dusk, standing beneath the porch light with the air of someone who believed his presence alone commanded deference. He introduced himself as Officer Harlan, though I did not remember seeing him at the river or during the initial investigation. His badge was real enough, but his eyes gave him away. Too restless, too evasive, darting between my face and the windows behind me. He said he was following up, then launched into a careful monologue about how grief can distort perception, how elderly individuals sometimes latch onto theories that offer meaning in the face of loss, how he was there to ensure I wasn't being preyed upon by misinformation or false hope. The entire speech was rehearsed, void of sincerity, and his tone carried the shape of someone trying to herd me back into silence. When I asked him why he had come so late in the evening, he merely smiled and said he thought it best to speak privately. I told him I had nothing more to add to the case unless the department was willing to revisit evidence they had once ignored. His expression tightened then, faint but unmistakable, like a mask slipping a fraction of an inch. He left without shaking my hand, and as he walked down the dark path toward his car, I noticed he did not glance back. People who mean well always look back. That visit marked the moment I understood I was no longer dealing with mere reluctance or indifference. I was dealing with protection, a network of individuals who had something to lose if I kept pushing. They were no longer content to let me wander in grief. They wanted to corral me into it, force me to fold myself into their narrative. And the more I resisted, the more forceful their strategies became. Neighbors who once waved now avoided eye contact. A cashier at the store asked if I was managing okay, with the kind of condescending tone that suggested someone had primed her. An acquaintance from a church group phoned me unexpectedly to say she was praying for my mind to find stillness, though I had never spoken to her about the case. I felt their hands, indirect, distant, but unmistakable, guiding public perception of me into a narrow box labeled unstable. They crafted this version of me with the same efficiency they had used when crafting the story of Luca's disappearance. But beneath that wave of external pressure surged something darker and more personal. One night, unable to sleep, I sat in my living room staring at an old photo of Luca and felt compelled to check my voicemail for the first time in weeks. Buried between spam messages and reminders sat a message from a number I didn't recognize. When I pressed play, a voice whispered just 2 words: "Stop digging." The message ended abruptly, leaving no clue about the speaker, but the tone, the steady, quiet menace, carried the weight of someone who believed they had every right to give me orders. I replayed it multiple times, listening for any distinguishing noise in the background, but the silence was absolute, and the voice too controlled to offer identity. It was not a prank. It was a warning. The escalation continued in ways small and large, weaving themselves around my daily life until vigilance became as natural as breathing. At the river, I saw footprints again, fresher this time, and cigarette ash on a stone near the path I frequented. At the library, someone had requested the same archive materials I was reviewing, leaving the checkout card smudged with unfamiliar initials. Even the woman in the green scarf, whom I had briefly connected with, seemed altered when I next saw her, jumpier, offering only a clipped greeting before leaving the cafe abruptly. Whether she had been approached by someone or merely sensed the tension around me, I couldn't tell. All I knew was that the ripple I'd created in still water had become a disturbance impossible to ignore. And then my son appeared on my doorstep without warning, late enough that it startled me, early enough that he could claim he was in the neighborhood. He stepped inside before I invited him, his face tight with sleeplessness, his shirt wrinkled, his hands trembling slightly as he removed his jacket. He said he wanted to talk, but the conversation never felt like talking. It felt like containment. He urged me to let the past rest, insisted my research was harming everyone, claimed that the police had expressed concern about my mental state. His words were soft, but his gaze flickered nervously, betraying a buried panic he couldn't quite hide. When I asked if he left the voicemail, he recoiled as though slapped, stammering through denials that were too forceful to be genuine. His visit ended abruptly when he realized I wasn't bending, and as he walked out into the night, he paused on the porch and whispered, "You're going to get hurt if you keep doing this." For a moment, I believed he meant physically. Then I saw the sorrow in his expression, raw, fleeting, and realized he meant something more complex, something entangled in guilt and fear and the fragile scaffolding of lies he had been balancing for 22 years. The most striking escalation, however, came not from them, but from a stranger. One afternoon, as I walked home from the post office, a car slowed beside me. The window rolled down, and a woman I'd never seen before leaned out, her face gaunt, her eyes darting nervously. She didn't introduce herself. She simply said, "If you want answers, talk to the woman who babysat him before he died." I asked who she meant, but she only shook her head and whispered, "They won't leave you alone after this," before the car sped off. Her fear clung to me like a second skin, and I hurried home with shaking hands, feeling the world tilt as possibilities I had never considered expanded before me. A babysitter. No one had mentioned one. Not once. When I asked my son later, under the guise of reminiscing, his face blanched for half a heartbeat before he recovered. He said Luca had never had a babysitter, that they handled childcare themselves, that I must be recalling something from years ago. But his denial was too fast, too crisp, and it left a crack wide enough for doubt to pour through. I began tracing back through old calendars, old holiday cards, old community newsletters, searching for names or faces that might align with the stranger's warning. And there, in the corner of a group photo from a summer barbecue, stood a woman I didn't recognize, leaning over Luca's stroller, smiling too big, too eager, her hand gripping the handle as if claiming it. I stared at that image for a long, breathless minute, knowing instinctively that this was the person I had been pushed away from for decades. The escalation reached its peak the day I learned that my daughter-in-law had been visiting that woman regularly, even after Luca's disappearance, even when she swore she had cut ties with everyone associated with those painful memories. Receipts, schedules, glimpses of patterns fell into place, forming a shape that made my pulse thud with dread. Whatever had happened to Luca, whatever truth had been twisted into a drowning, This woman, this shadow at the edge of photographs and memories, had been part of the story. And now, as the pressure around me tightened, as warnings and visitors and strange footprints accumulated, it was clear they were afraid I would find her, or afraid she would talk. That fear told me more than any evidence could. I was dangerously close to the truth. Close enough that the people who once dismissed me as delusional were now mobilizing against me. Close enough that their story, that fragile edifice built over 22 years of silence, had begun to crack. Close enough that, for the first time, I understood that whatever secret they had buried did not belong to the past alone. It was alive. It was moving. And it was watching me as closely as I was hunting it. I felt the moment approaching long before it arrived. A heavy, electric stillness settling over my days like the air before a summer storm, thick enough to taste, sharp enough to warn that something irreversible was drawing near. It began with a detail so small, I nearly dismissed it. A second letter, slipped under my door sometime just before dawn, carrying no address and no signature. Only a single sentence written in the same careful, almost trembling hand as the first. Message. "She is ready to tell you," it said. And though the words did not name anyone, my body recognized the implication instantly. The babysitter. The woman in the photograph. The shadow figure whose presence had hovered just beyond the edges of the official narrative for 22 years. I held the paper as if it were warm, as if the ink itself had been whispered onto the page moments before, and in that fragile stillness, I understood that the truth would no longer wait for me to gather my courage. It was coming, swiftly, whether I was prepared or not. The next hours unfolded with an almost cinematic clarity, each movement deliberate, each breath strangely amplified. I dressed with the calmness of someone preparing for a long journey, not knowing whether the destination held answers or more darkness. Outside, the sky hung low and colorless, as if the world itself had dampened its brightness in anticipation. I drove toward the address I had pieced together through scraps of receipts and old community notices. A place the photograph suggested belonged to the woman who had once been woven into my grandson's life without my knowledge. The house sat on a quiet, dead-end road, a narrow two-story structure with paint peeling from the shutters and a porch that sagged beneath years of unspoken stories. For several minutes I sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles whitened, wondering whether stepping onto that porch would rewrite my life or shatter it entirely. When I finally approached the door, it opened before I knocked. The woman stood there, her face drawn and pale, her posture crumpled as though she had been carrying a burden whose edges carved into her bones. She looked older than the photo, older than 22 years should have made her, and for a heartbeat, neither of us spoke. Then she stepped aside and gestured for me to enter, her movements stiff with fear, not of me, but of the truth itself. The living room was sparse, its furniture worn, its air stagnant with the scent of dust and something medicinal. The blinds were drawn, leaving the space coated in a dim amber haze. She motioned toward the sofa but did not sit. Instead, she stood by the window, twisting her hands together like someone trying to wring water from cloth. Her voice, when it came, trembled. She told me she had been waiting years for this moment, waiting for someone, anyone, to refuse the story the police had printed neatly into permanence. She admitted she had been the one to watch Luca on certain afternoons, not officially, not paid, just informally at the request of his mother, who had insisted she needed a little help. but didn't want my son to know. She said she had always felt uneasy around them, sensing tension she couldn't name, but she had ignored it because people often hide their ugliest truths behind polite smiles. Then her voice cracked, and she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth before forcing herself to continue. She told me that on the day my grandson disappeared, she was at the river too, not close by, not with them, but near enough to see the shape of their bodies, the line of their movements, the way they stood too close together, speaking too quietly, glancing around as if scanning for witnesses. She had seen my daughter-in-law carry Luca toward the water, not in fear or haste, but with the rigid determination of someone performing a task they had calculated in advance. She had seen my son standing behind them, his face pale, his hands trembling, looking not like a father in panic, but like a man trapped inside a choice he couldn't unmake. My breath caught somewhere between my ribs, sharp and cold, as she described how she had called out to them, how my daughter-in-law had turned, startled, and how my son had stepped in front of them, blocking the woman's line of sight as if shielding, a scene that should never have existed. She admitted she had told no one, terrified by what she suspected, convinced that speaking would destroy her life and possibly put her in danger. Her silence had eaten at her for decades, corroding her sleep, curdling her conscience, until she could no longer bear the weight alone. And when she heard I had begun searching, when rumors spread that I still believed he was alive, she understood she had been waiting for me, to confirm the instinct she had buried beneath fear. But the revelation that struck deepest, the one that stole the air from my body, came when she opened a drawer and pulled out a small, worn object wrapped in tissue paper. She placed it in my hands, and even before I unwrapped it, I felt the tremor of recognition down to my marrow. Inside lay a tiny plastic truck, yellow and scuffed from years of play, a toy Luca had once carried everywhere. I remembered watching him push it along the edge of my kitchen table, the wheels clacking rhythmically in a way that had charmed me endlessly. I whispered his name without meaning to, my voice breaking as I held the toy to my chest. The woman explained that she had found it near the river days after the police called off the search, half buried in mud, hidden behind a thicket of reeds. She had kept it out of guilt, wanting to return it but too ashamed and too afraid. And now, after all these years, she placed it in my trembling hands as a confession, a plea, a release. The room seemed to shift, the walls tilting inward as the truth washed over me in unbearable, unrelenting waves. Everything I had sensed, everything I had feared, everything I had been pushed into denying, it was all real, not imagined, not twisted by grief, not a desperate grandmother clinging to false hope. My instinct had been the only honest witness all along. I felt something inside me ignite then, not fury, not even heartbreak, but a clarity so fierce it felt like heat. I stood slowly, every bone in my body aligning with purpose, and told the woman I would go to the police, not the local department, which had been complicit in its neglect, but the state authorities who had no investment in preserving anyone's reputation. The woman nodded with a mixture of relief and terror, as if she knew that every sleeping ghost in this story was about to be roused. As I stepped back onto the porch, the air pressed against me with the heaviness of impending consequence. Down the road, a car sat idling, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. I knew then that the truth I carried was not just mine anymore, that the moment I placed the toy truck into evidence, I would unravel the narrative that had kept my grandson's story locked away in shadows for 22 years. And as I walked toward my vehicle, spine straight, heart steady, I felt the world hold its breath, knowing that nothing, absolutely nothing, could return to the way it had been before this moment. I wish I could tell you that after I left that house with the little yellow truck wrapped in my handkerchief, everything moved quickly and cleanly, like the last neat pages of a book. But life is rarely so considerate. Instead, it unfolded in jagged, uneven motions with long stretches of waiting and sudden lurches forward that left me dizzy. At the state investigator's office, they took my statement, took the toy, took the babysitter's name, and for the first time in more than 2 decades, I watched someone in authority listen without that glazed, patient look reserved for the elderly and the inconvenient. They asked questions no one had bothered to ask before. Why the original case had been closed so quickly. Why there had been no follow-up on the absence of a body. Why a woman listed as a family friend in early notes had never been interviewed. I sat there under the hum of fluorescent lights, my hands folded in my lap, and felt the old story. Child wandered, child drowned, poor confused grandmother begin to crumble at its edges. It did not bring me joy, not in the way people imagine vindication feels. It brought a tired, aching relief, like finally loosening shoes that had been 2 sizes too small for too long. News of the reopened investigation spread faster than I expected, carried on the same tongues that had once called me delusional, and with it came the quiet implosion of the careful life my son and his wife had constructed. There were interviews at their doorway, cameras they tried to push away, neighbors who suddenly remembered things they had forgotten for 22 years. My son did not come to see me, and I did not go to him. There was nothing left between us that could stand upright under the weight of what was being uncovered. I heard, through the careful words of the investigator assigned to keep me informed, that financial records were being examined, that travel histories were being checked, that old phone logs were being dragged out of whatever digital graveyard they had been buried in. Terms like possible conspiracy and custodial interference and fraudulent reporting began to decorate the air around my grandson's name, and each one landed like a fresh bruise on skin already tender. They asked if I was prepared for the possibility that he might indeed be dead, that all of this might excavate only bones and paperwork. I told them the same thing I had told myself all these years, that the truth, however brutal, was better than being forced to live inside someone else's lie. Weeks blurred into months, but not the kind of months that dissolve into numbness. These were taut, electric months, each day carrying the possibility of a phone call that would change everything. I kept going to the library, kept walking by the river, kept writing in my notebook, not because I believed any of it would affect the outcome, but because those routines reminded me that I was still a person with a life, not just a witness orbiting. An old tragedy. One overcast afternoon, as I sat at my kitchen table sorting through a stack of letters, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize, and when I answered, the investigator's voice was gentler than usual in a way that made my heart stutter. She told me they had found something, a trail of documents, concealed under layers of false reporting and altered forms, pointing to an unofficial placement of a child matching Luca's age and description in another county, signed off by people who had no legal authority to move him anywhere. It was not an adoption, not properly, but an arrangement, facilitated quietly and disguised as something else. At the center of that arrangement, like a spider at the heart of a web, was a name that hollowed me out in an instant. Not the babysitter, not a stranger, but a woman I had once trusted without question, a cousin who had drifted from the family years before and whose absence I had attributed to distance and time. They drove me out to the town where she lived, an hour and a half from my front door, yet somehow an entire life away. And as we pulled up to a small, neat house with red shutters and a crooked mailbox, my hands began to shake in a way they hadn't. Even when I first stood at the riverbank, they asked if I was sure I wanted to go in, if I wanted them with me, if I needed a moment. And I heard myself say that I had already been waiting for 22 years, that any further hesitation would be an insult to every night I had lain awake, imagining my grandson's face aging in the dark. So I stepped out of the car, walked up the short path, and before I could knock, the door opened, as if the house itself had been holding its breath for my arrival. My cousin stood there, older and softer than I remembered, her hair streaked with gray, her eyes shadowed with the particular guilt that comes from believing you did something right in the worst possible way. Behind her, in the dim doorway, stood a young man in his 20s, tall and wary, his features a blurred echo of a child I had held with jammed sticky fingers and a toy truck pressed to his chest. I wish I could tell you that I knew him instantly, that blood called to blood across time and distance. But the truth is more complicated. His face was a stranger's face, wearing my family's bones, his eyes searching mine with a careful skepticism that told me he'd been warned about me, or at least prepared. For a heartbeat, we simply looked at each other, 3 lives suspended between past and present. And then the investigator cleared her throat gently behind me, and my cousin stepped aside, murmuring my name in a voice so wrecked I barely recognized it. We sat in her narrow living room, the young man, my grandson, though I did not try to claim the word too quickly, positioned near the doorway as if he needed an escape route. And we began the slow, tangled work of unspooling the truth. My cousin confessed that she had taken him at the urging of my daughter-in-law, who insisted that the boy was in danger, that my son's temper and some shadowy connected men made the home unsafe, that this quiet relocation was the only way to save him. From an accident waiting to happen, she told herself it was a rescue, not a theft, that one day when the dust settled, they would come clean, that a child alive elsewhere was better than a child dead at home. The police report of drowning had been a solution to a problem, a way to close the door on ever having to explain where he went. Over time, the lie hardened into life, and my grandson grew up believing that his original family had wanted him gone, that the woman who shared his blood had not fought for him at all. Listening to this, I felt something inside me slowly reorganize, like furniture shifted in a too small room. I could not condone what she had done, and I told her so. Saving a child by severing him from everyone who loved him without their consent was not salvation. It was another sort of violence, however different from the one she claimed to prevent. Yet at the same time, in the rawness of her confession, in the shaking of her hands as she described long nights spent wondering when I would appear at her door, I caught glimmers of a terrified woman trying to choose the least bad option in a world that had never taught her how to trust the law. It did not absolve her, but it complicated the anger in my chest, turning it into something weightier and more mournful. And through it all, the young man listened, his gaze moving between her and me, like watching 2 halves of a book finally being pressed together. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, edged with a restraint that spoke of years spent learning not to ask too many questions. He said he had always felt out of place, as if a part of him had been left somewhere he could not remember. He said he had once asked if he had other relatives, and been told only that It was better not to dig. He said that hearing my name, and then hearing that I had never stopped searching, unsettled something inside him in a way he hadn't yet found. Language 4. I did not plead with him, did not press my version of the story onto him like a brand. I simply told him what I remembered in ordinary words, describing the way he used to fall asleep on my chest, the way he hated the texture of mashed peas, but loved the taste of strawberries, the way he would line up his toy cars in meticulous rows and then knock them all over laughing, insisting we start again every time. His face softened almost imperceptibly with each detail, as if the fog around his earliest years were thinning, letting in slivers of light. We did not hug that day. The distance between us was too full of ghosts, of choices made by other people, of years no amount of truth could return. But when I stood to leave, he walked me to the door himself. And as I stepped onto the porch, he said, very quietly, that he would like to see me again. Not as a duty or a spectacle or a case file, but as a person who might still have stories to tell him about who he was before the river became his official grave. That small request, modest and uncertain, and entirely his own, was worth more to me than any courtroom verdict or headline. It meant that the lie that had defined his life was no longer the only version available to him. It meant that somewhere beneath all the damage, a thread still existed between us, thin but unbroken. Now, when I sit in my house by the water, the river no longer feels like a thief. It feels like a mirror reflecting everything we did and did not do, the ways we failed, and the ways we refused to surrender. There are investigations still ongoing, lawyers still circling, words like charges and sentencing and complicity echoing in rooms I sometimes enter and sometimes choose to avoid, because at my age, I have learned that justice on paper is not the same as peace in a person's chest. My son's face appears in the news more often now, and I cannot look at it without feeling both grief and a strange, exhausted pity. He could have told the truth at any point along the way, and instead he chose a narrower, meaner kind of survival. I do not know if he and I will ever speak again. I do know that the silence between us now belongs to both of us, not just to me. If there is anything I can say to another woman sitting alone with questions everyone tells her are madness, it is this: the world will always prefer the version of events that lets it sleep comfortably, and it will try very hard to fold you into that version, smoothing down your doubts like wrinkles in a tablecloth. But the quiet voice inside you, the one that says something is wrong even when everyone else insists it is right, is not your enemy. It is the last honest witness you have. Hold on to her. Protect her. Let her lead you, even if the path she chooses is long and full of doors that do not open at first. Because sometimes, after years of being dismissed and belittled and told to move on, you will find yourself standing in front of a stranger who carries your family's eyes and your family's silence, and he will look at you and say, he wants to see you again. And in that moment you will understand that you did not waste your life on grief. You spent it carving a thin, stubborn passage through the rock of other people's lies, just wide enough for the truth and for him to finally walk through.